He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with close to 27 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we're back again today this time with a friend of mine and a colleague I've worked with. His name is Matt Ryan. He's the Senior Director of Comms Planning at Popcorn, which is Universal Resorts' in-house ad agency. Let's join the conversation. Okay, Henry, we're back for another episode of the Brief Brothers, and I am personally and professionally delighted to have with us Matt Ryan. He is Senior Director of Comms Planning, Communication Planning for Universal Resorts. Their in-house ad agency is lovingly called Popcorn. Matt, thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers.
Yeah, thank you both for having me. Delighted to be here.
I've known Matt now for a few years through my work with the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers. I've come down to Orlando at least twice, and then we've done a few virtual things where I've worked with your ad agency folks, your planners, your marketers, your creatives, to do workshops. So we've established a friendship and a professional connection because of our mutual love and interest in creative briefs. I want to start by talking about that process, because one of the things that I really admire about you and your group and your leadership with Scott Jackson is this lab that you have internally that you use to help develop the thinking around briefs. Matt, why don't we start off this conversation? Tell us more about what do you call this lab? How does it work? And how has it helped you?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. It's really just a fancy name for sharing our work in the early stages before you've gone off and done. We don't want to do the thinking in a silo. That's a really bad idea. So early on, I mean, creative teams show their work in progress all the time, some type of an internal check-in before you go, do the big presentation to the client. So it's kind of the same concept. Here's a sketch. But even prior to that, sometimes it's just, kind of we've done the requisite thinking around it as a team, and we want to get some creative input. And so here's an angle we might pursue. Here's an insight we've gleaned, and here's a potential direction or 2 or 3 that before we fully commit to something, we want to make sure that there's we have identified it from a creative standpoint as fertile ground for creative exploration. So I might come with the best insight in the world, but if it doesn't inspire good work, what's the point? Like if I go to the creative director and they say, well, that's great. Well, I can't do anything with that. That's a dead end. So let's talk about that early on. And that's what we do in the lab is to really just try to vet different ideas. And it's a start, because I think the best briefs are really an invitation to do great work. It's not a set of instructions. It's a springboard to help the creative team go do great things. So if we can identify that early on, that's what we try to do in the lab. Is like, here's some territories we might want to go in, and if one feels like, yeah, that's the way, then we will flesh out the full brief around that idea. And what I love about that, just to add a little more, is you get more diversified thinking. More importantly, I think you start to get, now the creatives have skin in the game, and they're advocating now for something that they believe is going to be really beneficial and pay dividends as they go to bring the creative ideas to life. So that's kind of what we do. Yeah.
What's the origin of the lab? Was it a kind of a group think idea, or did somebody come up with this idea? How did it happen?
I think originally when I first started, Scott Jackson, who is the VP of the internal agency, said, I want to, I've seen that there's maybe the brief writing could be improved, and everybody's really passionate about it, but I'm not sure there's a lot of know how to do it. Maybe we form, they were starting to do like a preview of briefs before they got too far. And then he had asked me just, based on my passion for briefs and my experience in past, if I could help kind of round out the thinking. And so we made some little tweaks. The idea was always there, is an early look into the work before we it's like think first, write last, was the idea. There's always that tendency, especially I made a lot of mistakes early in my career. You just want to grab the form and start filling it out, which is a terrible idea because you're just doing a brain dump without doing any thinking. So we wanted to make sure that we were getting the thinking going, and that was the origin of it, and really help people understand, what are you doing with this thing? What is the purpose of it? And it's a less about the form and a lot more about the thinking that goes into it. That's how you get to pay dirt. So that was kind of the genesis of it, and something that we've really enjoyed, and it's grown in popularity. We've found that the quality of the briefs has improved, but more importantly, the quality of the creative concepts has improved. So that's where we feel like we got traction.
So
My guess,
go ahead.
let me have to finish this thought. My guess is that, the fact that you've established this lab tells the entire world of your agency that we're building in time. We're building in the amount of time we need to do a good brief. Because one of the things that Henry and I talk about a lot, and we hear this a lot, and I hear it a lot when I go out and do the training on creative brief workshops, is that there's not enough time to write a brief. I've got 20 minutes. That's an exaggeration. I've heard it a couple of times. But am I correct in saying that this establishes the necessity of taking the time that you need to write a brief?
It's definitely, so it's not a required step. It's a highly encouraged one. And I think organizationally, we've bought into the importance of them, which is really good. You have to have that. No one would ask us to do one in 20 minutes. I've done it. I don't think they're very good. I don't think they're worth the paper they're printed on, but yeah, so I think organizationally we're committed. We've seen the direct result of better work, but we don't always get, all the time we want. We never get the time we want. So what we've tried hard to do is establish a way of working and a way of thinking, whether you've got 2 days or 2 weeks, that is a repeatable process that doesn't shortcut thinking. And a lot of that involves, there's a lot of legwork you can do before you're, if you're really attuned to what's going on with your customer, and you're kind of always collecting things. I think that's part of what a good brief writer should do, is really be curious and plugged into what's going on. And you're anticipating things before they come up. I guess that's one of the internal, advantages of being an internal agency, so that you can do a lot of pre-work, so that by the time you get the assignment, you're a few steps ahead. But yeah, I know I wandered off topic a little bit, but the point of it is that we are committed to making sure that we're doing them right, so that, because it cuts down on the amount of rework, which we were seeing a lot of if you didn't do it.
You mentioned that your boss came to you kind of for input into this process because of your experience. Was wondering if you could tell us a little more about that experience and how you came up in the business and how you ended up where you are now.
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking that. I started out on the traditional ad agency side at literally a small mom and pop shop, and where there was 5 of us. It was husband and wife run. And then, fast forward to today, and it's, a huge matrix organization, big company. But I spent the first decade, I'll say, of my career went kind of from a small shop to a medium shop to a little bit larger. Kramer Krasselt, headquartered out of Chicago, had an Orlando office. I was there for a while. I would say that was the first place that really started to impress upon me the importance of a brief. And I never forget also reading the book Truth, Lies, and Advertising, which I think we've all read and loved. And that was one of the first things, like, okay, this is some cool stuff. I really love the way John Steele thinks and the way he's going about it. And I remember at that point going to my boss at the time, proposing I was like, I want to try this format of a brief that Goodby uses. Can we do that? Actually, I just did it. And then I asked, and I got some questions, and it was like, all right, we can do that. But I had already gone to the creative director at the time, and I said, would this work better? And this was a pretty skeptical individual that didn't really necessarily, maybe like account people. And he said, he kind of looked at it for a minute. He said, yeah, actually, it's a lot better. So I said, great, let me go take it to my boss. That was the midpoint in my career. And then I went over to, I was at Disney for 16 and a half years, learned a lot about brief writing there. They're also very committed to that. And then here at Universal, the last 4 years of my career. So I was probably the first third of my career at traditional agencies, then in-house for the last 20 something years. And I think the way I kind of learned by making a lot of mistakes, if I'm being honest, and I wish
Welcome to the
I
club,
had,
Matt.
yeah, I mean, but the one thing I never lost sight of was how important it was to the end result. I think whether I had, a disgruntled creative director, that I was talking to about it, I mean, I could see the importance of, I remember the conversation too with the, and I'm going to leave names out of the equation, but, he said, I said to the individual, like, what, okay, help me figure out, like, I'm trying here. Hopefully you can see that. What is beneficial to you? And he's like, I tell you what, if you can tell me in a sentence what you want to do, great. If not, come back when you can. And I was like, okay, that stuck with me. I was like, all right, I got to distill this down. I got to encapsulate the whole thing in a sentence. And then I thought, I have no idea how I'm going to do that, but I'm going to figure it out. And so I started reading and going to ANA workshops and things like that, and just trying to really hone my craft and pick up any tidbits. I was very hungry, always very curious. And through the years, I've come across people like yourself, the Scott Jacksons of the world, and some other folks that I've worked with at the Mouse that just really cared about it. Interviewed a lot of people. I've come across, just picked up different tips and tools over the years, and now I've kind of collected that into my own little, handbook, if you will, of tips and tools, and I share that out because I want that knowledge to be made available to everyone that I'm working with, so that I think it just helps you get to the end result a lot quicker.
A man
Just a
after
little-
my own heart.
Yeah. Just a little insider here. When you refer to the mouse, for those of our viewers who don't know what he's referring to, that's kind of insider lingo for Disney, if they hadn't figured that out. But it took me a while to, it's like, the mouse, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, I get it. Okay.
Yeah. And that's
one of
not
the-
meant as a dig, by the way. That's just
No.
Insider lingo. Yeah.
Insider lingo, that's what it is.
Memories, yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know how you refer to yourselves, but at Universal, but every company, I suppose, has that insider lingo. One of the things that always baffles me, and I think I speak for Henry too, is the lack of this kind of pre-planning that we see, or at least I see when I go around and do training with other marketers. For building that process, building a solid process around the brief, the way you and your team at Universal has done. And it starts with great leadership. If you don't have that top-down commitment, it doesn't infiltrate to the rest of the team. And that's one of the things I've always admired about Universal. Do you find that in your discussions with people outside of your business, in other agencies and other people in the in-house agency world, do you find that what you're doing is unique, or is it spreading?
I think I'm going to answer it this way. I think that brief writing is a lost art. I really do. I've had people tell me that have come from the outside, and people that we work with, that when they see what we're doing, they're like, oh my gosh, that's really great. I should put more discipline into what I'm doing, but we don't have the time. That tends to be the excuse. But we know where that leads. We know that adage of, never time to do it right, always time to do it ever, right? But I think that probably the amount of discipline that we're putting into it is fairly unique. I've seen other places I've been that have the heart for it, but the way we've, and I don't have anything proprietary, by the way. I use your adage, Howard, is that amateurs borrow and professionals steal. So anything I get my hands on, now I do, joking aside, use permission, but I've used things from Page 74, I got bookmarked with verbs in it. I've used, there's a planner, and I'm not trying to show people here. I'm just naming up people that have been helpful to my career. Dan Carlton has his company, The Paragraph Project. He's a planner who kind of similar story to mine, just came up through the school of hard knocks, didn't really get formal training, but now he shares out, and I'm like a sponge. So I think what we're trying to do is a bit unique and maybe a bit of a lost art. It's not new and it's not proprietary. It's just law buried in the excuses of I don't have enough time or we don't do it that way. So and it's really just about organizing thinking. And I think as long as you stay curious and you have an organized way to, traverse through the digging for that insight is really, I think, what a lot of people probably don't spend enough time around.
Well, I know that whenever you and I get on the phone or do a Zoom call, there are never any silence. There's never a pause. There's never a silence because we're constantly talking about what we're thinking about. And another thing that I think that you and your group do so well is, and I don't know how often you do this, but it's your Friday afternoon. What do you call that? It's your inside hour or something like that.
Oh, we have on Fridays, we just, we call it Keep It Poppin' because that's in the, thematically related to
Right.
popcorn, which by the way is no secret. Our heritage is from the movies. So popcorn makes movies better, right? So that's what we try to do. But it's like Fridays at like right around 1 o'clock. And we'll just take a quick look at, because you can get kind of siloed in a matrix organization where you're working on maybe one thing, maybe Halloween Horror Nights, or I'm working on a new attraction, and you don't see all the great work that's happening because you're all in different meetings. So we just try to showcase, maybe it's a great brief, maybe it's a great way to change a clunky process. And of course, we look at great work that we try to just show, here's what your colleagues are working on. So that's I think that's what you're referring to on Fridays.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. You invited me to one or two of these where we've talked about a variety of things.
It just occurred to me. Yeah, go ahead. It's a different thing, but go ahead.
Well, then I also remember, about 6 months after I came to do a week's worth of workshops with you in 2018, which might predate you. Were you at Universal at that time?
I started in 2019, April of 2019.
Yeah, I was there in 2018, and I forget who I was talking to besides Scott Jackson, who was, like you said, is the VP. But about 6 months after that training, you guys called me up and said, we got about a page worth of questions that we want to ask you based on the training. And so we set up a Zoom call, and it was a full hour of conversation. And it just made me feel tickled pink just that you wanted to continue this conversation. And I've said this many, many times, and I even wrote something for Scott, that if all my ANA member organizations that bring me down were as committed and enthusiastic about brief writing, I'd still have a job, but it'd be an entirely different kind of a job, right? And that's what I've really admired about, and it's kind of surprised me that I've waited this long to have you on our show, Matt, because what I really want to get out there is what you and your team do so well, because it's working, and you've got results that can demonstrate how it's working. So, kudos to you.
I appreciate that. Two things I was going to say about that. One is I tell my team all the time that, like, there's not a for me a peak to this mountain. I don't want there to be, because that means if I feel like I've reached the peak, then it's going to be easy for me to get complacent. And I think as long as somebody maintains a continual thirst for knowing more and what works, and the more you talk about it, the more you understand. That's how I learned it. And I think then you never stop learning. You're going to always be, if you're committed to that. Scott and I geek out about just talking about briefs, and some people are like, I don't want to talk about briefs anymore. But we always want to talk about briefs. I was going to rewind just for a second to what you were asking about. Was something we set up. We called it Briefly Speaking. That was the Friday thing we had you in. What that is we said, to continually sharpen the saw. What if because too often you go to like a training or something, and then you go away and you forget. If you don't practice it, you're gonna, right? So I said, what if just I do an hour right after lunch. Once we were doing it maybe once every 4 to 6 weeks, and I would pick a single thing, like how do you do an inspired briefing? Because we all love to write, we fall in love with our words, and then we forget we have to transfer that information to human beings who are going to do something with it. And if you sit in a conference room and read the paper, how dull is that? So we had a whole session that you joined. We had GSD&M, one of the agencies we work with there, some of our own internal creatives, and just talked about what are some of the great briefings, what are some best practices you can do to get people to feel the point you're trying to make from the brief viscerally. How do you immerse them in what you're trying to sell to your consumer? And so that was one of the topics we've done around what's a tool you could use to write an SMP, maybe that you haven't used before. So a tool or a tip, that's what we try to do. And that's the whole idea, is ongoing education and continual learning.
Are you finding these days that there's a particular area in the creative, in the briefing, in writing the brief, that's a bit of a stumbling block that you're working to overcome? Or maybe something or a stumbling block that you have overcome?
I think no matter where I've been, the biggest, the most overused word is insight. I think we'd all attest to that. Finding a true one is hard work, and I think there's a lot of times that we'll state a very obvious fact or a behavior that is nobody's going to argue with, and we'll call it an insight, and that's not necessarily true. So that's not unique to here. That's just a brief writer's burden, I think, is how do you dig? How do you probe? What questions can you ask? How can you interrogate the data to really try to maybe sometimes even, it's not about always finding the answers, but you get, I read this from a post my friend Dan had put out there, is sometimes those searching questions can lead to better questions. And that's okay, because you're ultimately trying to uncover a human truth that you can connect to on a very basic emotional level, and make an appeal about whatever product or service you're trying to sell. And so finding that insight, I think, is, I wouldn't call it a stumbling block, but it's I think it's the most important part of the brief and the hardest part to really nail down something truly unique, to go from
even harder than the proposition.
I think so, because I feel if you get that right, the way writing a good SMP is always a daunting thing, but I never start there. I should say never. That's too absolute. Rarely start there, because I got to know who I'm talking to first and what it is that makes them tick. That is for me to then say something that's interesting to them, something that's relevant to them, something they would care about. And if I don't know that, then I'm the SMP is not worth much. So really digging into that, I think, is to me, here's the double. It's the hardest part, but it's also the most fun part to me. Is I feel like I'm playing detective. I'm trying to go scrape the landscape to look for clues. And sure, we have no shortage of information. We have a ton of people here with PhDs and not, really, really smart people. And we've got tons of data, but
binders full of data.
Yeah, like getting through all of that into what, and they will tell you that too, by the way. We've had a lot of interesting philosophical questions, philosophical conversations around, well, what does this really mean? Like and is this a human truth, or is this a load of nonsense, about what we're trying to do? So I think that's the best way I could answer your question, Howard, is really getting to that. And that's probably the hardest part for anybody as a new brief writer too. They'll want to take the client brief, or in our case, we don't call them clients because they're internal, but the strategy brief. And, there's a tendency to get lazy. Okay, well, it says, there's my description of my audience. Let's use that. Well, yeah, that's a great place to start. Here's the analogy I use. that is the lake we want to fish in. It's my job as a brief writer to describe the fish we're going after. What type of lure do I use? What time of day they bite on this particular.
So you have two briefs.
We have a strategy brief that we get from our business partners that tells us. So it'll say like, okay, here's how we want to position Mardi Gras, one of our festivals, and here are the essential things, the product, right? They're giving us a product briefing, if you will. And here's, sort of what we're after business wise. And then we're translating that from, company challenges to consumer challenges and how do we connect in. So it's not technically two briefings. It's more of a marketing task, if you will. And then we write the creative brief from that. But it's easy to get.
Is it like a client brief, even though you don't call them clients?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it is. It's got all the I'm a firm believer that both are a good thing. I don't think one replaces the other, but the creative team should work off the creative brief. Like it's our job to distill that down to obviously the most salient points that are.
A man after my own heart. I've said it already once. I could have said it another couple of times.
Matt, I've never seen Henry this quiet. He's just sitting back and taking it all in. Like he's I think you become his admiration point, or he is your fan, big time fan.
So I want to go back to one of the things about like finding an insight and what to start with a single-minded proposition. What I found, and this is just for me, and I do when I teach brief writing, I do try to instill it into people, is that there's no one way to write a brief. In other words, it's an iterative process, and sometimes you start filling out the boxes that you're more comfortable with and familiar with because you're coming at an assignment. Sometimes you do have an idea for an SMP and you start from there. And then to me, if you already have an SMP that you, as a brief writer, as an experienced brief writer, you really like, finding an insight that supports it is usually pretty easy. Because a good SMP is rooted in some fundamental human truth. And you've already kind of, through magic or whatever, gotten to that stage. So then it's just a matter of articulating what it is, the underlying motivator or inspiration. But what I've found is just the process of going through the entire brief a couple of times in and of itself makes the brief sharper. Like I find, and I teach this in my workshops, a lot of times there might be things that I include in the target description that really can be reshaped and might be the insight, right? Like I realize that. So, and sometimes there's things, so I find I tell people, cut and paste is your friend, because a lot of times your first draft of the brief, everything will be there, but it might not be in the right boxes, or you might have duplication of the same idea or thought across multiple boxes, and you don't want that in a brief because you want so then it becomes an exercise in how do we get from A to Z in the most streamlined, economical manner in which the reader doesn't get lost, right? So that there's no threads that I open during the target description that aren't paid off for in the insight or in the single-minded proposition. So I think just the iterative nature of writing a brief in and of itself can help you uncover or polish some of those diamonds in the rough that might be in there in the first draft. So just that act itself, which
100%.
is not something that happens if you're just filling out a form, right? Like if you're filling out a form, it's like, okay, I checked that box, go to the next one, and that's it, you're done. It's really that, like you said, looking for clues and saying, but does this clue is important, but does it really fit here? Where does it need to fit to tell this story the way I want to tell it?
Totally agree 100% with everything you said. And that's why I corrected myself. I said that I rarely start with it. Sometimes you're right. It's just there. And you're like, this is okay. Like, of course you would. And believe me, I've reverse engineered many things to work on that, because there's something inherent in that promise that you're making that's strategically rooted in a truth.
I find that when you're very familiar with a brand and you're familiar with the target, sometimes you have an SMP that's waiting for a brief,
Yeah.
right? It's somewhere in
Yeah.
your mind, you already know the deep issues of a company or the deep issues with a company relative to the target, and it's an SMP that's just waiting for a brief. So, and that's not always the case, nor should you shoot for it to be the case. But I wouldn't want an experienced brief writer to doubt his first instinct if he's been sort of preparing for this moment the entire time he's been working on the client.
And
Totally.
that's true with creatives. As a former creative, I can't tell you how many times, but I often had an initial idea, a headline, after hearing just hearing the briefing, reading the brief once or twice, and I would write it down. And then the challenge was, is this the best I can do? Where else can I go? And sometimes I would discard it. It would never come back. And sometimes I'd go writing line after line after line, and I could never do better than that. I'd have other
I
ideas.
think the lesson is gut instinct should never be instantly discarded, nor
Yes.
should it always be respected. Like gut
Mhm.
instinct has its role in brief writing. Like sometimes your initial inclination is right. I think the good brief writer is introspective and is challenging his assumptions to make sure that, and that kind of goes back to your point about the lab. I mean, I don't have a lab, but one of the things I try to do when I write a brief is I try to pressure test it. Like, could I create a campaign from this brief? And what would that campaign look like? And sometimes I share it with creatives and sometimes I don't. My objective there is not to sell them an idea that they will then sell back to me, but rather to tell them, yes, this idea that I'm introducing in a brief does have legs. And this is just one of many legs you could give it.
Well, Henry, let
Yeah.
me just throw some out here, because even though you don't have something as formalized as what Matt's talking about, a lab where you have this time and this space to discuss aspects of the brief, you have said many, many times in our conversations that you always talk to your creative director, and because you believe that the creatives have input. And you said occasionally it happens that you'll give a brief to the creative department and they'll come back with an idea that just had nothing to do with your brief. But because you know, and you're a humble guy, you recognize that sometimes your brief sparked an idea that you never even thought about, and you're open to that.
Absolutely. That's the organic nature of this iterative process of listening to ideas and getting outside input.
And that's my point. It sounds to me like there is a lab-like informal structure within your own working process.
The ideal brief will have been screened by the creative director, and whoever, usually he'll have a lieutenant he'll assign to a particular assignment, and I will sell them on that brief before going to a briefing with the broader creative teams. Sometimes they buy it lock, stock, and barrel. Sometimes they have input or questions, and I try to address that, and then we move forward. The reality is sometimes there's no time. And like right now, we're in the middle of December, and this year it seems like every client and every prospective client in the world has decided that they need to do something before the end of the year. And of course, we're closed the week between Christmas and New Year's, and everybody's like winding down and wanting to already, start relaxing. And so sometimes you just don't have the luxury of the time and you say, hey, here's what I got. And you don't want to be the bottleneck, right? As the brief writer to getting creative started, which is, I think, another powerful positive of that lab approach is that even though you're discussing the brief, Matt, you're also kind of giving the creatives a head start on the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it gets the wheels turning, the hamster on the wheel, as they say. And I always like to think of it as a start of a conversation. And even the briefing itself, it's a living, breathing thing, and I think the lab does a couple things. It's really just a formalized way to get, when you do that, then you're like, okay, we're allocating time to this. It's important. That's what it signals. But if I walk up to, the creative's office, and I say, hey, I do that all the time. It's just the way I'm wired, and we have conversations or over coffee, whatever, in advance of that, after that. I love that. One of my favorite things that happened to me here, because it was just almost second nature to me in the agency world, but coming in, you're the new guy for a while. But when there were three creatives, I can say first names. It was it was Rob and Scott and Howard. There were three of our top creatives, and they called me. They said, "Hey, we've been looking at this brief. Can we talk about, like, we're tracking with everything. Can we talk about the S&P?" I was like, "This is great." Because if you ever walk out of a room and there's no questions, then that scares me a lot more than questions. Like, that means
You
I have
befuddled
said
them.
either, yeah, I'm like, okay, questions are good. I was like, this is great, guys. Yeah, let me tell you how we got there. And if these words aren't doing it, then they're malleable. Here's the idea. And when I kind of unpacked it for them, they're like, okay, the light bulb went off. And then it's like not about the words on the page, it's the thinking that you committed to. And I'm like, look, if we need to go somewhere else, no, the S&P is fine, we got it now. But in that moment, totally willing to change direction, because it's about inspiring their work, and those words aren't going to the consumer. Whatever the creatives write will. So I loved that. And I also wanted to go back to something you said earlier, Henry, which is I'm 100% aligned with. There's no right way. In fact, I find probably linear is sometimes harder, if you go top to bottom on your brief. I just have a way that kind of works for me, but even within my own working, I zig and I zag, and 100%. When we look in the lab, we see things are right away. I'll see it in the why we're advertising. I'm like, well, there's your insight. We'll move that later. I don't care about the boxes up front. I just want people to get their thinking down. And then it's easy to organize that, to your point, to tell the story. So yeah, I will typically start with those sections around audience, and we have some things that we do in advance of that to try to organize the thinking. Just collecting all that you know about the audience, and putting that on a worksheet that you'll never see in the brief. And then organizing that thinking, making a list of the things the things you want to know, that you wish wish you could know. And you do a lot of that legwork, and then you're right, you put it down on a paper and you move things around. At the end of the day, you're just looking for a thread that's tight and tracks strategically from top to bottom. And one of the things Scott Jackson and I have talked about, when I tell people to write an S&P, I say write it as plain as you can first. Say it square and then say it with flair. Like, what did you say, Howard, in our workshop? You said the goal should always be clear over clever. And I 100% agree.
And you know who I was quoting? Henry.
Okay, I love that. Clear. I used that. See, I stole like you taught me. It's okay, professional. But yeah. I told in a recent truth told, I said, I heard something from Howard. It's like, be clear, then you can worry about being clever. Because you can always go back and look. If there's a more inspirational way of saying it, great. If not, who cares? But I say, write it as plain as you can. And then what this happens with me naturally is I'll find maybe a more inspirational way to say it in the S&P, but whatever I wrote as my first draft of the S&P sometimes works really well in the why. I think those things are so connected naturally. They should be, the why and the S&P. So that's just a kind of I guess, an accidental thing that happens, but it ends up being true is you just move things around. And so yeah, I'm 100% on board with all that. There was something else you said in there and I've lost it, and it'll come back to me in a minute, but I was totally tracking with that.
Matt,
I was just going to say one of the things that I did mention, and maybe you were referring to this, so I'm shooting it in the dark, was removing stuff that doesn't lead anywhere.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yes. Because you thought it was going to lead somewhere, and that's why you put it in, but ultimately you realize, oh no, we're going in this other direction. But the hygiene of the brief to get to eliminate like loose ends and dead ends, to me, is really important, and it makes the brief briefer. And I like your where you do exercises that don't go into the brief directly, but that inform the brief. That's where we talk about reductionism. This is ultimately
totally
a task that is a reductionist task, getting to the diamond, and forget about all the other stuff, byproduct that comes in to get to the diamond, that's okay. You set that aside. That's process. You don't need to show, it's not quantity here that matters. It's quality, getting to the right stuff.
Yeah, in fact, that is exactly what I was talking about. It made me think of, so there's a lot of parallels between this passion and another passion of mine, which is songwriting. And there's I had the pleasure of meeting years ago a professor by the name of Pat Pattison, who teaches at Berklee College of Music. Hosted him when I was at Disney, brought him in as like a creative writing exercise. And he talks about, in art, there's this concept of unity, like everything is nothing without purpose. Goes way back to Aristotle, right? To get all philosophical. And in music, it's called prosody. So everything has got a purpose. And in his book on songwriting, there's a quote that I love, and I've forgotten the playwright's name, but the playwright said, if you put a gun in act 1, it damn well better go off by the end of the play. Otherwise, get it out of there. So that is exactly what you're talking about. Like maybe you thought there was something interesting and you put it down, but if it ultimately doesn't fit the thing the path you're trying to go down, it's fluff and you need to get it out of there. So yeah, I really appreciated that as well. I think the hygiene is a great way to look at it, of the brief. So yeah, trimming out that fat.
Well, Matt, there aren't any guns in our conversation, but
yeah, that was not a comment on guns. It's a quote from,
I understand
the playwright's name. Yeah.
But Henry and I both appreciate having you on the Brief Brothers. Matt Ryan, the senior director of comms planning at Popcorn, Universal Resorts in-house ad agency. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. I could talk for hours, but I know this is a time thing. So thanks again.
We got material for the next time. So you're welcome back.
We will bring you back. Absolutely. So
thank you both.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.